Good evening. I am Karen Taylor, Program Director of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen, and I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's lecture, which is part of the Artisan Lecture Series. The Artisan Lectures are supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. I would also like to thank Jessica Gillow of Monacelli Press for all her help with tonight's talk. Monacelli Press published Codex New York, which I just happen to have here, and I want to mention at this point that this striking book of photographs will be available for purchase through Books on Call and our bookseller Erin this evening. Tonight's talk is part of Archtober, a celebration of New York City architecture and design throughout the month of October that features hundreds of architectural events related to architecture across the city. For those of you who are less familiar with the General Society, a brief introduction. The General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York was founded in 1785, and this is our 234th year of existence. We are a non-profit organization, and I want to point out that we were originally founded by 22 artisans. Today, our organization continues to serve and improve the quality of life for the people of the City of New York through our educational and cultural programs. These include our lecture series, of which, of course, tonight is part of, our General Society Library, which, of course, you are sitting in, and I'm very pleased to announce that the library will be celebrating 200 years next year. We also have Oh, thank you. We also have a tuition-free Mechanics Institute geared towards the building and construction trade. And finally, we have the John M. Mossman Lock Collection, which you can just see upstairs, and you are welcome after tonight's program to go up and visit it. Tonight, we have the pleasure of welcoming both Stanley Greenberg and Elizabeth Goldstein. Mr. Greenberg will start tonight's program by presenting some of his images from Codex New York. This will then be followed by a conversation with Elizabeth Goldstein, President of the Municipal Art Society. Stanley Greenberg is a Brooklyn-based photographer and author of numerous books, including Invisible New York, The Hidden Infrastructure of the City, Waterworks, A Photographic Journey Through New York's Hidden Water System, Architecture Under Construction, and Time Machines. His photographs are in the collections of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the New York Public Library, the Yale University Art Gallery, and the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, among many others. Mr. Greenberg has received a fellowship from the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation, as well as grants from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, the New York Foundation for the Arts, and the New York State Council on the Arts. Elizabeth Goldstein joined the Municipal Art Society as its president in 2017. Ms. Goldstein has an extensive background in parks and historic preservation, advocacy, and management. Throughout her career, she has worked to ensure transparent public engagement in civic decisions of consequence to public space and the heritage of key places across the United States. It is now my great pleasure to introduce to you Stanley Greenberg.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you to the General Society, and thank you all for coming. In 2013, I walked every block of Manhattan. Actually, 2012 to 2013. Codex New York is a collection of photographs from that walk. And now I'm going to answer some of your questions. 31 weeks, 1 day each week, 1 pair of shoes, I didn't lose any weight, a small digital camera, public libraries, playgrounds, and Starbucks. And this is my first book in color. So why did I do it? My first idea, which I knew was correct and then wasn't correct, was that I was going to photograph big empty spaces around Manhattan, the spaces where buildings have been torn down or where there have been parking lots for a long time, where you get to see the backsides of buildings or a view that won't be there in another year. So I sort of made mental notes as I walked around before the walk and realized, okay, the only way I'm going to really find these places is if I do something systematic. So I got a small camera to carry around with me. Before this, I had only worked with a view camera, a 4x5 camera that you put on a tripod and use a cloth over your head. So it's not a walking around camera. So I needed something to take notes with. And I set out from Brooklyn, and I got on the subway, and I went to the Battery and started walking. And I had printed a little Google map of the neighborhood. And I think it was within the first half hour or so that I realized this is not at all the project that I thought it was. And there are all these different aspects of the urban landscape that are everywhere or are in only a few places. And I thought, I've spent enough years studying the city that I should be able to figure out what's going on here and try to be able to explain it to other people by cataloging and creating a taxonomy of the city. So I realized then that I was going to do the whole walk. And I would go out one day a week with the camera and with a map from a particular neighborhood and photograph everything from churches to playgrounds to hidden infrastructure that I knew where it was that you would never know, places where the old city met the new street grid, places where there was geology and topography, especially uptown, places where there might have been underground streams, places where interesting people lived at some time, where was the old waterfront, how did Manhattan change over the decades and centuries. So it was kind of everything that I had learned before gave me an idea about what to photograph. Also, not always correct, but enough to get me started. So, well, let me ask you a question. How did you all get here? Most of you walked or took the subway? And what did you notice on the way? Or were you on your phones? Rush hour. So I wanted to point out things to people that are right in front of them that they probably don't notice. So that's what the book is about. One of the things I was really interested in was how you can find the hidden infrastructure by knowing what's above ground. So I've walked the routes of all the water tunnels, and I did a whole book about the water system. So I knew pretty much where the tunnels were in Manhattan, but I didn't know exactly where all the shaft sites were. And each tunnel has a different set of structures every couple of miles or so on the sidewalk that you would walk by and you wouldn't pay any attention to it. Sometimes it's a manhole cover, sometimes it's a square diamond plate cover, and sometimes it's a ventilation tower, and I'll show you some of those pictures in a little bit. But there's so much of this knowledge that you can look up if you have the time and then go out and look for things, and so much of it was in my head already. I thought, well, I'm going to take advantage of that and photograph all of those things as I see them. So I'm going to show you a few of these maps and then the pictures. So I tried to get to, well, how can I say it? I did it neighborhood by neighborhood, but sometimes I'd get to a whole neighborhood in a day and sometimes not. As I got further into the winter, there was less daylight, so I had less time to shoot. But I'd pretty much go until there was no more light each time I went out. I went out usually on Wednesdays. Obviously, the parts of Manhattan that were a grid were a lot easier to figure out. I did a lot of backtracking in the West Village and Uptown, like that. And I did a walk I did a walk of the entire East Side one day and an entire West Side one day, just so I didn't miss the waterfront. So, type to enter a caption. So this was from one of the first days, and one of the things that was interesting to me, this is right near the World Trade Center site. Other than there being cows there, which is unusual, there must be 4 or 5 different surveillance cameras in that picture. And that's an aspect of the city that there wasn't maybe 15 or 20 years ago. And there are all these, so I'll show you some of the vacant spaces. And one of the things that was new for me was, since I was working with this little camera with a lens that was small enough to fit through a hole in a fence or even a hole in a sheet of plywood, I could get in a way to these spaces that I never would be able to do with the other camera. And it also creates this illusion to you that this is a big open space that you could see if you were walking by. So it is a big open space, but you could only see it if you either climbed over the fence or peeked through a little hole. So these are a bit deceptive in some ways, which is what photography does. So this one's on the Lower East Side, if it hasn't collapsed completely. I passed by a lot of these sites over the last few years, and some of them are still vacant. Some of them have 60-story buildings on them. This one's been built on. It's right near the Citicorp Tower. Some of them provide the only green on a block. Let me see if I can go back. That's, I want to say, about 140th Street, Uptown. That looked more like a Civil War ruin to me. That's down on, that's in the 20s on the east side. That's way downtown. That's Nolita, if we use that term. That's way uptown. So I mentioned the idea of the taxonomy of the different sites before, and there was so much overlap. I did have to figure out when I did the book what goes in what category. So there are a bunch of empty spaces that also have buttresses in them, and that seemed like a more important taxonomy. So I started looking for those. Places where a building's been torn down that provided the structure, some of the structure for the building next door, and then everyone realized that building was going to fall down, so they had to build something, sometimes fairly quickly, I imagine. You'll see by the look of them. Some of them well-engineered, some of them just kind of slapped up there. So I really like that one. It's just like, how many beams can we put in one little space? And it's almost like the tires are an anchor for the other side. That's one of the more substantial ones. Although I've been by there recently, and the buttress is gone, and the red building is gone, but the space is still empty. I think it's probably about to be built on. That's in Chelsea. This one is probably the biggest one that I saw. There's a really enormous one, like at least that big, way down on, it's either Church or West Broadway, around, yeah, you've seen it, okay. Yeah. This one obviously was a, wait, it's going to fall down sort of a thing. One of my other favorite categories were the little streets, and most of them are concentrated in the older parts of the city. And there are a few in the newer parts, but I'm sure you recognize this as Chinatown, Doyer Street, before the mural was painted on the street. Down the financial district. And in the West Village. This is one of the alleys that was inhabited by lots of artists in the 40s and 50s until they couldn't afford it anymore. Anyone recognize this one? Okay. So another thing I thought about when I walked was how whatever neighborhood I was in, the people who lived there knew their neighborhood pretty well, but nobody else did. I mean, lots of people come to Midtown, lots of people go to the financial district or Chelsea, but not everyone goes to the more residential parts of Manhattan, and it was worth pointing out what's in those places for everyone else. So this is Jumel Terrace, and behind where I was standing is Mars Jumel Mansion, where Aaron Burr lived for a while till he was kicked out, and where Lin-Manuel Miranda wrote Hamilton. So there's a lot going on up here, and you can, I believe you can rent apartments in these buildings, but you are not allowed to improve them. They're a landmark. This is a tiny little street on the west side called Weehawken Street. I'm guessing that's some connection to the ferry, but I'm not sure. Weehawken Market? Great, thank you. There's so much I don't know still. So Uptown, what struck me the most and what was most different about it was how the topography is completely different from the rest of Manhattan. There are enormous rocks and boulders and stair steps to go from one street to another. I've read that someone's trying to build an apartment building here, which would be a real tragedy. I just love this spot. And this one too. I think this might be the rock that was in the Times a few weeks ago that real estate companies are fighting about. This one tried to get away, so they had to fence it. And this is far uptown in Fort George. This one also tried to get away. So, I mentioned earlier the places where the old part of the city met the street grid, which are the downtown sites or the far east or far west. But this is far uptown where there also was no grid. This is Fairview Avenue, and I remember the first time I saw this building, and I was just so struck. I've never seen a building in New York that had two different curves, one on each side from the other. And I've gone back just to look at it a few times. It's really amazing. I'm not sure what it's like to live in those apartments, but I'd like to see them. And there are, of course, all these Flatiron buildings where some of the streets that are not parallel with each other meet. This one, so another thing you often read about New York are the places that don't advertise in any way, and they're restaurants or some kind of club or whatever. And I never would have known this one. I was waiting across the street to meet some people to go to a restaurant, and I kept watching people go in that brown door. And I thought, who lives there? Why are so many people going in and out of there? This is on 7th Avenue South. And finally I went over to the door, and one of those little plaques there, it's a bar. So it's open to anyone. You just have to know that it's there. So financial district, obviously, also not a grid. I almost included a category of photographs that security people tried to get me to not take. But it tended to be not the most interesting taxonomy because some of the places were completely nondescript. And up in Harlem. This is where Riverside Drive is close to its finish. Back downtown. Everyone knows that building? Where Edgar Allan Poe spent some time. It's called the infirmary? Dispensary, that's right, thank you. I knew I couldn't get away with anything here. I also went to, I don't think there may have been one cemetery I didn't photograph, but I visited all the cemeteries. And this is the African Burial Ground Memorial, which has a big sidewalk shed over it now. I think maybe they're working on one of the buildings next to it. It's a really great site if you haven't been there. And I went to the 3 Shearith Israel cemeteries that kind of trace the expansion of Manhattan. I was reading about, this is the first one in Chinatown, and I was reading a description of it, and they talked about how it was just like a few yards from the waterfront, and now it's like 3 or 4 blocks away. So you get some idea of how much bigger Manhattan is than it used to be. This is the next one in the Village, and the one in Chelsea. This is down in Trinity, or sorry, St. Anne's. This is Trinity or St. Anne's? St. Anne's. This was the first private cemetery that's on 2nd Street. That's the second private cemetery around the corner from it. That's, I think that's just about the only single person, can we call it a cemetery? It's called the Amiable Child. It's right down the steps from Grant's Tomb. Thank you. I don't have to talk, you can finish. So this is the Uptown Trinity, which is on land that was owned by John James Audubon, where I happened to be on his birthday, so he got his picture taken. And I'm a birder, so I was really interested in that. And there are all these great murals. They had just started them when I was photographing, but the whole neighborhood is filled with murals of birds now. It's really worth going up to see. Parking. Something I think shouldn't exist, basically. But there are parking lots everywhere, and parking structures, and parking sheds. And the parking sheds were the most interesting part to me. Some of them look very corporate. Some of them look like somebody slapped them together in a day. Like that. Or that. That one, no, that could have been included in the places people didn't want me to photograph. The owner of that parking lot really did not want me to photograph his shed. And of course, Santa Claus. Diego Rivera had a problem with that parking sign. And of course, to go with the parking sheds, the enormous amount of space that parked cars take up under the High Line, in Soho, in Chelsea, Flatiron, everywhere. With an entrance. So years ago, somebody wanted me to do photographs for a book about skybridges, and I was kind of interested in that subject, so I started work and took some pictures, and then their money ran out, so we didn't do a book. But I had already done the research on the skybridges, so I knew where they were when I was walking. And this is probably my favorite one. It's on Staple Street in Tribeca, and it's got to be one of the oldest ones, and it also has like a little piece that sticks out on the other side, so it's the only one I know of that looks different on each side. These connect the courts and the prison. So I guess Google owns this one now, but or maybe not quite, but at one time I was told that the DEA was on one side of that bridge and the New York City police drug team was on the other side, and they filled the middle of it with old furniture. They didn't want to talk to each other. I guess that counts as an insurance sky bridge. Back, that's Chelsea Market. So bigger bridges are all around the island, and I was interested in what happens when you build a bridge, what happens to the rest of the city underneath when you build a bridge. So you have an entrance and you have towers and all these things that probably either wreck or distort or if there was no neighborhood before, create a neighborhood. So I walked around a lot of towers at the bottom or underneath. This is far up on the east side. That's right near where the polo grounds used to be. So you've all been to the High Line. You know that that used to be a train line. It used to go further south, and it used to go right through this building, which is Westbeth. And the Williamsburg. So this is where the Queens Midtown Tunnel comes out. Also, just an enormous amount of space that I assume was a neighborhood before. There are also train tracks all over Manhattan, and I don't mean the subway. This is the Amtrak line on the west side. You mostly don't see it because wherever you walk over it, the walls on the side are so high you can't see over. So I had to do a little bit of climbing. And this is the same track, but far uptown in Inwood. Feels like another country. That's the entrance to the Lincoln Tunnel. Also Lincoln. That's one of the Amtrak bridges. That's the High Bridge, which brings me back to my favorite water system. If you haven't walked over that was opened, I think, maybe 2 years ago after some work, and that's really worth a trip, too. In fact, when they built it, that's what people did on the weekend. They would go for a trip to see High Bridge. Underneath the Henry Hudson. There are playgrounds in every neighborhood. There were definitely lots of things I found that were not in every neighborhood, but every neighborhood had playgrounds. Often themed by what they were near. I mostly shot during the day on school days, so most of them don't have children in them, but might have been a holiday that day. There's a Tom Otterness playground. Seals. You know, Manhattan's surrounded by water, right? So I mentioned that I walked all the way around it, and I had photographed these kinds of structures for my first book on the west side, and they've all kind of been cleaned up, and the one in Long Island City has been cleaned up. This one still has the kind of old rust and paint that makes it look more original. These are barge float terminals for loading up barges to go across. This is way up. That's the Bronx across the way. Down in Tribeca, not real grass. And the Seaport. I was reading another book about Manhattan, and apparently, this is up on Dyckman Street. There was a beach here even in the 18th century that was written about, and it's still there. So this is the Muscota Marsh that Columbia rebuilt, or I guess built. It wasn't, I'm sure it was a marsh once, but this is the neighborhood that was kind of blown up so that the Harlem River could be expanded, and why part of what you're seeing across the river is still considered part of Manhattan. Despite all the construction, there are still a few old things that remain, probably because either they weren't in the way or someone made another use of them. This must have been a very old gas station that's now part of a federal, I think it's just a car garage. And this one, and I think the next one, these were power stations for the old elevated subways, elevated trains. This one too, on, I think it's Allen Street. An old factory. I haven't figured out yet what was there. Hotel. So that was a Woolworth. And that was a library. There used to be, there are a few stairways that go down to the Hudson. This is up near like 168th Street. And this stairway used to go down all the way to the water, and then they built the highway, and they just left the stairway. They cut off the stairway, and they left it there. It's fenced off. You can't walk down into traffic, but it's kind of odd to see it there. And obviously, it's not taken care of. A little mile marker. This is right in front of Morris Jumel Mansion. And a clock you've probably seen on Lower Broadway. So this is a relic, but also brings us back to the water system. This is in the ground just northwest of the Shakespeare Theater in Central Park, and it's part of the original wall of the first reservoir that was in Central Park. There used to be a sign there that told you that. The sign is gone now. I don't know why. Now it's mostly a place to trip over. But that the Great Lawn was a rectangular reservoir that Olmsted didn't really like, and he convinced the city to let him build a much more naturalistic looking reservoir, which is what we have now. And then this one was taken out and filled in, which is why for such a long time there were drainage problems in the Great Lawn. So this is a little tunnel that leads to one of the gatehouses at the reservoir in Central Park. That's right at one of the transverses. You can walk by there. There's another. And that's High Bridge Tower. That was built for the Croton system. And then, so I mentioned that there are these 3 tunnels that distribute the water around the city, and they all start in the Bronx, or Westchester, and they come into the Bronx. And then tunnel number 1 goes through the Bronx and south through Manhattan and then to Brooklyn. Tunnel 2 goes from the Bronx across the Sound to Queens and then to Brooklyn, and they meet at Fort Greene Park. And the 3rd tunnel, which they started building in 1970 and which is almost finished, starts in the Bronx and comes to Manhattan, and it splits at Central Park. Part of it goes north and then turns back around and comes up to 59th Street. The other part goes to Queens and then to Brooklyn and then to Staten Island. So I found all of the shaft sites. So when they build them, every couple miles they would build a shaft to get down there, and they would eventually meet underground as they built section by section. So every shaft has a structure at ground level. So these are from tunnel number 1, and I'm going to go south from here in Manhattan, and we'll just trace the route. So this is in High Bridge Park. This is a little bit further down. I think, what street? This is at 135th Street where the big gatehouse was. The gatehouse is now a performing arts center. And there's a bunch in Central Park. So this is right on Central Park West. Also in the middle of a playground. And then on a transverse. And then it comes down 6th Avenue. That little panel in the sidewalk in Rockefeller Center is one of the shaft sites. That's right at Bryant Park, around the corner from where we are now. So we went backwards, sorry about that. This is at 25th Street. This is actually a double header. It's a monument to, I can tell you. Oh, why do I even bring my notes? Thank you. But if you go in that door, that's the shaft down to the tunnel. That's at Cooper Square and Delancey Street. And that one's been rebuilt. That's in Chinatown. There's a brick building there now. That used to have this incredible building with an apparatus that you would go in a capsule down the shaft a couple hundred feet, and you could turn off the water to Brooklyn, which they never did, so they took out the apparatus. These are, so we can do the same thing. I don't know if I took you all the way down. These are shafts from the New Water Tunnel, most of which don't look like this. They mostly have ventilation towers like that. So we'll get a bunch of these here. And they all have little entryways with cold air coming up from 300 feet down. That one's right at Columbia. That one, there's an incredible valve chamber down from there. That's on the 79th Street transverse in Central Park. And on the east side, that's in Chelsea, not far from the Whitney. And further down, West Village, Tribeca. And then it goes east. So that's, what street is that? That's Grand Street. And then it turns back uptown, so that's in the 30s. Those towers are in place now. When I was there, they weren't there. And then it ends right there at 59th Street. And so do we. Thank you. Should we sit in the dark?
Good evening, Stanley. That was lovely. What a fun way to look at the city,
Thank
huh? I thought we ought to start by talking about the taxonomies that didn't make it into the book. I noticed that you mentioned at the very beginning when you were talking that there were things you photographed like churches and things that you decided not to include.
Right.
I have a guess why, but I'm interested in your answer.
Well, one of the things I photographed were places where artists, mostly from the New York School from 50s and 60s, but also earlier from the Ashcan School, where they lived. And I decided they were just going to take too much explanation in the book, so I didn't do it. It was fun seeing where Jackson Pollock lived and Ed Reinhardt and lots of different studios that de Kooning lived in. But I also didn't know how interesting that would be to people that were interested in the rest of the things in the book. So I left those out.
What do you think? Is that the next book? I think that may be the next book. Well, I dove in with that question, but I just want to say that I've known Stanley for a long time. We met each other in the early 80s, and he has done something which I consider incredibly courageous, which is he ditched a government job and went to work for himself, making these incredible photographs meticulously and carefully for now a long, long time. And it's been a pleasure to watch him do this incredibly courageous thing. And you are seeing the results of just one of the kinds of methodical projects that he's done for his art and for all of us. And I just want to thank you for doing that.
Thank you. Obsession can take you a long way.
Yes, clearly an obsession, but in a very good way. So I think it's interesting that you are observing the city in a way that most of us don't do on our daily basis. You were asking us all whether we were looking at our screens as we were coming. And of course, there is an enormous temptation to do that, even for the best of us as observers.
Right.
But you described a little bit of the way some of the places that you've been to have changed, even since you took these photographs. And I'm interested in whether or not, there's lots of gnashing of teeth, especially in Manhattan, about how the city is changing and losing some of its character. I'm a professional teeth masher, so I know that. But I'm interested in whether there are some observations that you have of the city that we might not have noticed, that you observed as you moved around. Fewer parking lots, for instance, or I don't know. You tell us.
Okay. That's a great question. I'll try to distinguish between the things I've noticed since I did the book and the things I noticed from before I did the book and when I was doing the walk. So I think, but one thing that kind of crosses both ways is that it's become a little bit more pedestrian friendly than it used to be.
That's a good thing.
Not a lot, and there's a huge way to go. But I mean, even I remember walking in some places during the walk that now I go to, and there's a pedestrian plaza, and that's great. So I'm happy to see that. I think probably the worst thing that I saw, and you've probably all seen this too, is how many blocks, if you sort of stand across the street and look at a block, and absolutely every shop is part of a chain. And those were clearly the least interesting blocks for me too. I mean, there was a temptation to skip some of those blocks, but I didn't. But you know, when there's 3 or 4 banks and 3 or 4 drugstores on the same block, or 3 or 4 of the same fast food places, that's not the New York that I love or that I know, and I don't know how we fight that.
Well, that's probably a conversation for another time,
Right.
or certainly with wine. But
Yes.
I think that is a good observation. I've made the same observation. I was actually in Cooper, next to Cooper Union recently, and many of
Right.
you know that when you look around, there's some very interesting modern architecture there, but a lot of the bases of those buildings are CVS's and
Right.
fast food, and not Orange Julius, as some of you are old enough to remember Orange Julius, I'm sure. But I think it's interesting that your observation about the plazas and the squares, and that has been a change in New York.
Right. I mean, obviously, most of that happened during the Bloomberg administration, and a few things carried over. I don't think they've been as aggressive. I mean, there was a big agreement signed, I guess, yesterday for complete streets, so I expect more to happen, although as good as it is, they put a 2-year delay on it, so, we have to wait some more. But as a cyclist and a pedestrian, I can only hope.
Yes, we all have to hope and keep our fingers crossed and
Right.
do a little bit of advocacy to make sure
Or a
those
lot
things
of
happen.
advocacy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I guess the one of the things that I observed about the book as I went back, I've been a long observer of Stanley's work, as you can tell. And this book is a little bit different than some of your other books,
It's a lot
even
different.
even though it has the following similar characteristic, which is that you are very much photographing the things that your average pedestrian probably walks by and doesn't absorb. So we all see those little parking sheds, right? But we don't necessarily absorb them as observers. And I think you are an extraordinary observer, and you have popped all those things for us. And I suspect as we're all out on streets, we'll see them a lot more than we used to.
I hope.
But I thought your chapter on relics was kind of an interesting thing, because most of the things you photographed here are the things that fade back. They either fade back deliberately because they weren't intended to be observed,
Right.
like all of the things from the water tunnel. Those are deliberately supposed to be gray and no one's supposed to see
not
them,
really
right?
Visible.
But in the relics, those were often things that were designed to be seen and who've lost their luster. And I'm curious why you included that section, and whether or not my observation that those are exactly the opposite. Those are the places that were meant to be seen and have lost their power to attract our eye, whether there was something about that was kind of a reverse concept from some of the other things you were photographing.
It was actually kind of a tough call. I wasn't sure about that category till late, and I think what kept me doing it was that I was thinking about these places that, like, how are they actually still standing? Like, things that just, they were not in anyone's way. So, it just by pure luck in a lot of cases. I mean, I've read a lot about Tokyo and how there's such an enormous turnover of buildings there that there's so little that's old. And here, I don't know, for some reason, a few things remain. And I'm sure I missed a lot of them, but a few of them I caught.
Yeah, maybe somebody's going to spiff them up one of these days and
Well, that
turn them
happens
into something
sometimes.
else, of
Right.
course.
I mean, all the brownstones that everybody wanted to tear down for urban renewal,
Right.
lots got torn down, but the ones that remain now, everybody wants them. So.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's true. So I think I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I suspect we probably should turn to the audience and let them ask some questions of you too. But I'm just curious, when you started out, you talked about this a little bit, whether you had an idea of what some of the parts of the Codex was going to be. Did you know that, I mean, I know some of these things like water tunnel things you've been concerned about and interested in for a long time, but those small streets, did you imagine that you were going to have a section of photographs that were going to be about those small streets when you started off? How many of the categories did you already have in mind when you started?
I think within the first hour or two, I had a few categories in mind. And some of them I didn't really pick up on until like a few weeks into the walk. And I thought, okay, do I need to go back and look for those? And luckily I had photographed some of them inadvertently, so that was okay. And I knew that if I had missed things, there would be more of them. So it was kind of a, let's see what happens as I go. And some of them I knew, like the topography, I started thinking about maybe halfway through, but I knew I wasn't going to see it until I got uptown. Right. So I basically went south to north, with a few little exceptions. So there were definitely things that developed as I went, and then there was the difficulty of how to really, what goes into what category. So that was difficult too.
Oh, yeah.
But fun. And the other thing is, I've never taken this many pictures. For the earlier projects, there'd be maybe 5 or maybe 10 pictures in a day. And I'd come home after a day of walking and there would be 300 pictures, and I'd think, oh my God, what do I do with all of these? And I'd have to look through them. I mean, I'd look through them fairly quickly just to take notes, in case I wanted to remember where I was for some of them, and start a little bit of editing. But it really, one of the reasons it took so long to make the book was that it took a long time to edit everything.
This is what happens. Beware when you go from a 4x5 huge view camera to something you can stick in your pocket.
Yeah,
untoward things begin to develop.
Yeah, it's ugly.
Well, there must be some questions in the audience. I know. Yes.
In the red.
Yeah, the red hat. You're very visible back there.
Hello?
Do you have a mic for the
I'm going to ask
questioner?
if you wait till the mic comes. We're just recording this.
Thank you. I want to thank you for the extraordinary chronicle of New York, of places that even the most devoted New Yorkers have never seen.
Thank you.
My question...
Go out and see them.
Yeah, I shall. My question to you is there another book with other when you explore some other things?
There's
you might have
100.
already in mind, and
I already have one done.
Pardon me?
I already have one finished.
Oh, right. And what might those categories be? Number one. The second part of my question is, you said that you were walking around New York between 2012 to 13. Would another book or another chapter include the changes that the before being those pictures that we've seen, and 5 years later?
You mean, would I go back and do it again now?
Yeah.
Maybe. If I get through the other
changes,
projects.
because New York is so dynamic, it changes all the time. So
Right.
I was wondering if those same places might have changed. There's a high-rise there now. Or
Right. I'm sure that they have. I don't think I would go back and photograph the same sites, but I might do the walk again, and I think that would give you enough of an idea of whether the city changed or not.
Yeah, you might go to the Bronx.
Right.
Right, or
That's right.
Brooklyn.
That's right. So what is the new book?
So I found a book a few years ago called Springs and Wells of Manhattan and the Bronx that the first time I looked at, I thought, this is a crazy man. A man named James Rule Smith wandered around Manhattan and the Bronx around 1900 on his bicycle with a box camera on a tripod. I don't know how he did that. There were very few cars, or no cars maybe.
And very good balance.
And very good balance. And he photographed the springs and wells that people mostly used mostly for drinking water, but also for their cows and their dogs, and for children to play in, and even that supplied some factories. And he wrote about them, and in a really humorous way. And I thought, total crazy man. And about 5 seconds later, I realized I was going to do the same thing. So I mapped out, there are about 150 sites in the book, and I went to all of them, and I photographed them all. And the book will be my pictures and his text and his pictures, and with any luck, it should be out next spring.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Stanley. Their quick question: where did you grow up? Do you have a favorite neighborhood? And do you remember how the passion took hold?
I grew up in Brooklyn. What is you mean a favorite neighborhood from the walk?
Exploring, yeah, a favorite New York neighborhood.
Well, I think I had the most fun on the walk when I was up in Inwood, because it was the neighborhood I knew the least.
That's a perfect answer, because that's where I grew up.
Okay, there you go. Okay.
And I know every inch of that neighborhood.
Great. So do you know where the springs and wells are that are still there?
Well, do I know where the springs and wells? Somewhere near
Maybe
Inwood Hill
not.
Park, I would think.
There's actually one with a
Yeah.
sign on it in Inwood Park, so
Yeah.
you can find that one.
Yes.
Yeah. And what was the last question?
When did this passion take hold? What made you leap from your government job?
Well, I had kind of figured out before I took the job that I wanted to be a photographer. I didn't think I could make a living at it because I didn't want to do any kind of commercial photography. So I would take a few weeks off each year and go someplace to photograph. I went to Japan for a month. I went to Florida for a few weeks, things like that. And at some point, I thought, okay, I can't really wait too much longer. I had 6 months of vacation time saved up. And my wife, Lynn, who had just started working as a teacher, said, well, if you're willing to live on a starting teacher salary, then you should just quit. So I did.
Thank you, Lynn.
Hi. So in looking through these photographs, I realized that a lot of them sort of have a similar framing. I'm assuming you probably shot a lot of them with the same lens if it's a point-and-shoot camera.
Well, it's not exactly a point and shoot. It's just a small digital camera.
Oh, okay. What I was going to ask was, how do you sort of, in making the decision to take each photograph, are you looking more for a documentary style where you're sort of trying to catalog these blocks? How does the desire to catalog these things in sort of a documentary style relate to the desire to produce a good standalone photograph? And did you think about that?
That's actually a really interesting subject, because before this project, I wanted to make, the one picture about a subject that told you as much as I could tell you. So, and it was usually big and very formalist. And this project I knew had to be different, and I wasn't sure that I could do it. I was never a street photographer. I was never a walking around kind of photographer. So I think in the end, I brought as much of the sensibility of shooting with a view camera to this kind of project while still having the same flexibility, having the flexibility of the little camera and the walking around. And I knew that some of these pictures were going to be things that I was really happy with, and some of them were going to be good enough, but conceptually they fit the category, and that was the other thing that it was about. So it became much more also about the process of the walk than the individual photograph. I knew that it was more of a collection of photographs than a set of individual pictures.
Thank you.
There's one up front here too.
Stanley, in all your walking about, did you detect some or any Dutch influence in remaining in Manhattan?
Funny you should ask that. That relates to another project. Not a lot. I mean, mostly it's downtown, and I was reading, I guess, Russell Shorto's book, which is a great book about Dutch New York. He talks about the point where the Dutch realized that they could sell the water rights, and people would just start building further into the water. So I was pretty conscious of where Manhattan used to be and where it is now, and just the narrowness of some of the streets downtown. But there are almost no Dutch buildings left in Manhattan. I did a bike ride one day in Brooklyn, and I went to all 13 of the Dutch houses there. So if you're looking for Dutch influence, I think that's where you see it more physically. Sorry? Right, Dyckman House. And there are a bunch in Staten Island too, which I haven't visited yet. So there's a question back there and a question over here.
Thank you for your interesting presentation. Just curious, are all the photos in your book captioned with an address and maybe a little description?
Not the address. Usually the neighborhood, and the book is divided into categories, so you know which typology or category you're looking at. There you go. And there's a paragraph at the beginning of each chapter. Thank you.
Hey, Stanley.
John.
You know, yesterday I was photographing, there's a group of people actually right now walking from New York to, they're mostly DACA recipients walking from New York to Washington.
Right.
And there's one woman in a wheelchair, and they're having to go on whatever kind of terrain they're on. And,
wow.
And I started thinking about, you think about what people see when they're going through like an urban area. Mm-hmm. And if you're in a wheelchair, you have a really, I remember someone told me this in a wheelchair very early in my career. I never looked at sidewalks the same. So, right. This looks one way to you. I see it very differently, like how this might take. So I was kind of curious, since you know a lot about this, did you notice the sort of wheelchair-friendly infrastructure, and when did that start happening in New York? Do you remember?
I certainly noticed the lack of it.
I'm wondering about that.
I want to say curb cuts became more prevalent in the
When was the American
70s?
Disabilities Act?
Yeah. Do you know this?
Yeah, New York started installing curb cuts, I think, in the 70s and 80s.
And the ADAA pushed it a lot.
Pushed it even further,
Right. But I get an inkling of what it must be like to be in a wheelchair sometimes when I'm on a bike, because you need a curb cut there if you got to bring your bike up to lock it up on the sidewalk. But yeah, there were plenty of places where I thought, wow, how could I get through here if I was in a wheelchair? And there are plenty of places where there are so many cars on the sidewalk that also block your way. So we're far away from being a wheelchair-friendly city.
And very little in the subway infrastructure. I mean, at least buses.
Oh, yeah. Well, there's so few elevators. Yeah. Bathrooms, too, we don't do well with.
Last question.
Thank you for your amazing presentation.
You're welcome.
You apparently took me into a lot of details that I had not paid attention to and make me realize New York is an amazing city with layers and layers of history. And what's also very amazing is that it's so dynamic right now.
Right.
Everything's changing and it's getting faster and faster. Architects from all over the world, urban designers, they keep changing the city and keep changing people's experience and keep changing the history. We are making history. And I am among one of them. I'm fairly young. I'm still trying to get my license, but I'm very excited to be here and listen to you talking about your perception of New York, which is very different from mine. Mm-hmm. Just my question is, because you pay so much attention to details and you're so interested in those layers of history, those tracing those history down in small items, do you have any suggestion or do you have anything you want to say to people who are currently making the city or trying to make it better? Any advice?
Just a small question.
I know Elizabeth has some suggestions. I would say, I mean, the pendulum seems to be finally swinging back away from cars towards more pedestrian and bicycle and wheelchair-friendly design, and that's a great thing, and that has to be pushed. But the other thing that I know Elizabeth is active with is how do we stop building these, these pencil-thin, enormous towers that don't really have anyone live in them? We need to have how many homeless people who need places to live, and we're not building for them. And that's where the money should be going rather than those towers.
There's an upbeat finish for you.
I can always be counted on for that.
I have a question that has nothing actually to do with your book, but you know so many
Wait
things.
for the mic.
Okay,
Yeah.
Okay, this will be the last question.
Yeah, all right. And I'm sorry for this, but I love what you're doing, and I love how you explore the city. And what I mentioned when I'm walking through the streets here, I saw all these wires through the blocks, through the streets, and they are very thin, and I have no idea what they are for. Do you have an idea what is it for?
You mean they're almost like a thread?
I don't know. I have no idea. They're on the top somewhere. Some people throwing their shoes about it.
Some of them, I mean, the very thin ones that are not any kind of utility lines, some of them are, what's the Hebrew term?
What?
Eruv. That lets you, if you're an observant Jew and you need to follow certain rules, if you're within an area that has that string around it, there are some rules you don't have to follow. I know that there are people in the audience that know this better than I do, so they could answer you, but that's my elementary understanding of it.
Okay, thank you. I heard that, but I couldn't believe that.
There are probably other wires up there that look like that do other things, probably having to do with surveillance, but I don't know what they are yet. Okay. I'll work on that. Okay. Thank you all.
Stanley and Elizabeth. First of all, Stanley, I want to thank you for your presentation and your photographs. They were a revelation. You took us on a journey. I know it's been said also very eloquently by other members of the audience, but we will definitely see the city with new eyes. And thank you for your observations that you've so eloquently presented. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
we would like to make a presentation to both you and Elizabeth as a mark of our appreciation for you sharing your expertise with us this evening. And to do so is the real executive director, Victoria Dangle.
Yes. And Stanley, thank you so much. As a native New Yorker who loves every inch of this city, and I really do, you gave us a fascinating walk through the city with a really renewed and appreciation for everything. And to this young man who asked about the one thing that you could do to, to see more. Oh gosh, I see so often people walking in the street looking down at their phones, and they're probably new to the city. Or I see someone in a stroller who gives their kid a phone, and I say, oh my gosh, you have to be looking up from an early age and scouring and appreciating, because every building looks different each day with different light, and there's so much to see and to love. So thank you for helping this native New Yorker to love her city more. And on behalf of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York, founded 1785, we express our gratitude to Stanley Greenberg, photographer, for Codex New York, Typologies of the City, in conversation with Elizabeth Goldstein, president of the Municipal Art Society, so for his participation in the General Society Artists and Lecture Series. So thank you, Stanley.
Thank you.
And to Elizabeth Goldstein, president of the Municipal Art Society, in conversation with Stanley Greenberg for her participation in the General Society Artists and Lecture Series. So thank you so much.
Wow.
And because Stanley, we know there's another book in you, we have made you a lifetime member of the library, so that is for you. Okay. And Elizabeth, because we want to see more of you too, so we've given you a lifetime. You will. Yes. All right.
Come and hang out here now.
Okay, good. We love your company, so thank you, and thank you to our audience.
Thank you all for coming this evening. I do want to express our appreciation to Elizabeth and Stanley again. And very importantly, I want to mention that this book is now for sale. And I'm sure Stanley will be happy to autograph any copies of it. And I hope you'll bear with us, because I am going to usher Stanley straight to the book-selling table. So, and I'm sure he'd be happy to answer questions there, because I'm sure you still have many more questions. Again, thank you so much for coming, and I hope you'll join us now for a glass of wine. Thank you.